How do we ensure our students know exactly what they're working toward in their language learning journey? In this episode, we're diving into can-do statements, how to make them concrete, student-friendly, and aligned with proficiency levels and ACTFL communication modes. We'll explore yearly and unit-specific can-do statements, their role in guiding instruction and assessment, and practical strategies for crafting effective statements that support student growth. So, let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you for joining me here on the World Language Classroom Podcast. Every week, it's great to hang out with you to talk about language teaching and to remind you that you are an incredible language teacher because you're taking time to listen to a podcast about language teaching. Just one of the many things I'm sure you do that make you an incredible educator, so I thank you very much for doing that. So in this episode, we're going to be talking all things can-do statements. And so can-do statements, these are hopefully not a new concept to you, but if they are, I'll quickly tell you what they are. So can-do statements are these statements that come from ACTFL and other places, and they state exactly what students can do or will be able to do in a particular unit or throughout the year. They're a guide that's based on proficiency levels and communication modes to focus exactly on what students will be able to do with the language rather than just what they know about the language or being able to talk about language features. This really comes down to the idea of language functions. So when I talk about proficiency, I like to just use the simple definition that proficiency is what you can do with the language and not what you know about the language. Now, you might know a lot about the language, and that's helpful, but it's not exactly helping you to be able to do something with it. So when we talk about proficiency, it's what you can do with the language and not necessarily just what you know about the language. And as we write our can-do statements, they help to keep us focused on what students are going to be able to do with the language primarily once you have completed a unit or an entire year of study with them. So we're going to look at writing effective, concrete, and student-friendly can-do statements that are based on proficiency levels and also the ACTFL communication modes. So if you're able to bring that all together, they'll be very effective, because if they're not student-friendly, they're not going to be effective. If they're not really concrete, they're not going to be effective. And if they're not based on the proficiency levels and include all the communication modes, then you're not really being effective in terms of the different areas that you're hitting on. So we want to make sure that our can-do statements are concrete, they are student-friendly, and that they also tend to the proficiency levels and the ACTFL communication modes. So we will look at how to do that, and we're going to look at it from two different lenses. One is a yearly can-do statement that you might have for your entire course or your entire semester, but a longitudinal kind of way of looking at it, whereas we can also look at unit-specific can-do statements, which will take those year-long or semester-long can-do statements and break them down to more manageable chunks at the unit level. And once we have these can-do statements, they will be very useful for us as the language teacher, but also for students in guiding their own learning, and we can assess their progress, and they can also be aware of their own progress in meeting these can-do statements as they go through a unit and also through the year. So we're going to break it down yearly and unit-specific, and then making sure they're concrete, student-friendly, proficiency level-based, and also including all of the ACTFL communication modes. I think it's important to take a quick step back from getting into the nitty-gritty of the can-do statements and to just address the idea of success criteria in our classrooms. Because if we don't start at this wider lens of what we're doing and we just go to the nitty-gritty of the can-do statements, then we can get a little lost in the weeds a bit. So when we talk about success criteria, this comes down to asking 4 rather simple questions that can be a little challenging sometimes when we look at our classroom. And so the first question to ask is, what is being learned? And this is where we're talking about the content. What is the content that is being learned in our classroom? And then we have to ask ourselves, why is it being learned? That's our rationale. So we start with our content, what is being learned, but then we want to ask, why is it being learned? What's the rationale? What's the reason that it's being learned? And that can be a hard question to answer sometimes. And if we do have a rough time coming up with a good rationale or reason for why that content's being learned, then maybe we have to be okay with changing the content or looking at it from a different way. But anytime we have content in our classroom, we should be able to answer, why is it being learned? And once we have that answer, we want to then start looking at our assessment process and ask, how will I know that it has been learned? Like, what is the evidence that students produce that demonstrate that it has been learned? So we have our content, what's being learned. We have our rationale, why is it being learned? And then how will I know that it's been learned? So we have evidence of mastery. And then the final question is, what will I do with what I learned? So this is now post-assessment, likely, and we want to know, why did we learn this in the first place? We had our content, we had our rationale for why, we have our evidence that it was learned, but ultimately, what are we going to do with it? And we refer to that as transfer. So we have our content, our rationale, the evidence, and transfer. So what's being learned? Why is it being learned? How do we know it's been learned? And what are students going to do with what they learned? And you may even want to write your can-do statements for a unit or an entire year based on those 4 questions so that students can actually have that as a guide. I sometimes use that when I'm writing my can-do statements, not all the time, but I wanted to put it out there as an option for you as you're looking at your classroom and the curriculum that you're teaching. But I do think it's a good place to start to really understand why we are teaching that content and what students are ultimately going to be able to do with it. And when we look at what will students do with what they learned, you can come up with some really good can-do statements there that are truly focused on proficiency, going back to that idea of what students can do with the language, not just what they know about it. So what are they going to do with that content and language that they've learned? So this idea of success criteria is a good starting point to really frame what you're doing in your classroom. So then when we look at really specifically writing can-do statements, we do want to make sure that they are clear and that they're student-friendly descriptions of what learners should be able to do with the language at a specific proficiency level. So it's not just to be able to do something, but specifically what is the language function, the language text type that they will be using to understand and engage with the language. So not just being able to do something, but what is the actual language that they will be using to engage. And as we read our can-do statements, we want to make sure that we do go into the 3 communication modes. That's interpretive reading and listening, that's interpersonal speaking, and then presentational speaking and also presentational writing. So there are the 3 communication modes that we are going to use as we're writing our can-do statements. So we don't want them to just be in one of the modes, that they're just going to understand or just be able to speak about or just be able to write about, but we want to make sure that we are writing can-do statements in each of the modes. And once we have those can-do statements in each mode, it's the reminder to us to make sure that we are addressing all of those modes in the classroom as well. And it keeps that communication in each area alive. Because when those can-do statements align with the modes, they ensure a truly comprehensive language development, rather than just being siloed in one of the communication modes. And as we have these can-do statements, they are going to provide goals for language learning. They're going to help guide our instruction and then help students self-assess their own progress. I began with success criteria as a way of framing how you might look at can-do statements. So I want to also talk about Bloom's taxonomy as another way to frame your can-do statements. And we're going to get into writing specific ones for the year in each unit, but I just wanted to give you some ideas for how you might be thinking about it in your classroom. So start with that success criteria with the content and the rationale, the evidence, and then the transfer. But then also consider Bloom's taxonomy. And this is not a new concept. Bloom's has been around for a long time, but it is a classification system used to define and distinguish different levels of what's referred to as human cognition, which is thinking and learning and understanding. So we do this at different levels. Teachers often use Bloom's taxonomy to guide assessments and curriculum and instructional methods. Now, the original Bloom's taxonomy is from 1956, and it was revised by Lauren Anderson and David Krathwohl in 2000. And there are some major differences in the revision, whereas each level of the taxonomy was a noun in the original version, and they were changed to verbs in the updated version. The revised Bloom's taxonomy starts with remember, then understand, then apply, then analyze, then evaluate, and then finally create and design. And I actually like to use Bloom's taxonomy as I'm writing can-do statements because at that novice level, students are understanding and beginning to apply. So I tend to use that level of Bloom's as I'm writing my can-do statements for novice level students. So at the remember level, I'm using words like arrange. So I can arrange, I can define, I can label, I can list, I can match, I can memorize, I can name, I can order, I can recognize, I can repeat, I can reproduce, I can restate. All of that is based on that remember level. And you can then go on and do the same thing with understand. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes to my blog post on Bloom's taxonomy. And what I have in there is a document that you can download where it has a list of verbs for each level for remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create and design that you can use as you're writing your can-do statements. So those examples I was just giving for that novice level at remember, I can arrange, I can define, I can label, I can list. That is an example of what you'll find in that document. But there are a whole list of verbs you can use for writing can-do statements at each level of the Bloom's taxonomy. So you would begin at that remember, understand, apply level with those novice level learners. And as you get into the intermediate, you'll do more of the analyze and evaluate, and then get really into creating and designing with high intermediate into advanced students. But that document has a list of all the verbs that you can use to create your can-do statements in all three of the communication modes. So you can get that in the show notes. So you can download that document with the Bloom's taxonomy verbs right in the show notes. So that was some background and some high-level view of writing can-do statements, so starting with our success criteria or using Bloom's taxonomy. So now let's look into the specifics of creating can-do statements. And we'll start with crafting yearly can-do statements. So these are statements that should reflect broad, overarching goals for the entire course. It may be a semester, it may be a quarter, it may be a year, but it's an overarching goal for your entire course. So these can-do statements should be ambitious yet achievable and provide a clear roadmap for the year. This is where you want to get to at the end. I often set these for my classes, and then as I write report card comments, I write specifically where students are in relation to those yearly can-do statements. Are they reaching them yet? Are they reaching them with a lot of scaffolding and support? Are they going beyond what those can-do statements are for the year in terms of the objectives? Or are they really not close to them yet and they still require a lot of support and guidance? So it's a good way to keep focused on what the goals are for the year, and it makes writing those report card comments much easier for me, and they're so much more effective and concrete. when I have something to look at very specifically. So as we are writing these can-do statements for the year, just remember to keep them aligned with the proficiency levels, the ACTFL proficiency levels, and those guidelines help in setting up appropriate targets. So are they going to be novice high? Are they going to be intermediate low? Are they going to be intermediate mid? I've actually created my own versions of novice high plus and intermediate low plus, so it's a little more than just intermediate low, but it's not really intermediate mid, particularly if you have an 8th grade class or a 10th grade class, depending on when they've started their learning. But I like to keep those as a way for students to engage in going from those intermediate low to intermediate mid, which can take some time, but to make them feel that they are leveling up and that you can write can-do statements for the year that are actually in line with that and they feel manageable and doable. So some examples of yearly can-do statements. For the interpretive mode, so interpretive listening, interpretive reading, you could say, by the end of the year, I can understand the main idea and some details in texts and conversations on familiar topics. For the interpersonal mode, you could say, by the end of the year, I can engage in conversations on familiar topics using simple sentences and asking appropriate questions. So you can see the simple sentences or maybe chunks of language, that's where you're going to add in the specific text type of the proficiency level to make it really concrete. And then for the presentational mode, by the end of the year, I can present information on familiar topics using phrases and simple sentences. So again, you're adding in the specific text type of the proficiency level of the students. And as you are grading and you are giving feedback and you are writing report card comments or something like that, you can refer to this. Is the student able to use phrases and simple sentences when they are writing, when they're speaking? If you're a third of the way through the year, halfway through the year, 3/4 of the way through the year, they very well might not be there yet. And so you'll address that in the comments, that they are nearing that target with scaffolding, but you are confident that in the coming weeks and the coming months that the student will be able to achieve that goal more independently and reach that target independently and not relying so much on the support and scaffolding, such as maybe chat mats or something like that. So you can refer to these overarching yearly, quarterly, or semester can-do statements as you are giving feedback on student progress on grade reports. And then we can look at writing can-do statements that are unit-specific rather than looking at the overarching. So these statements break down the yearly goals into manageable, focused objectives for each unit. And they're likely going to be more content-specific, whereas it's more proficiency level specific when you're doing those larger year-long overarching goals. Unit-level goals, yes, they are using proficiency levels, but maybe not the goal proficiency level for the year yet, because that's what they're building up to. So it may be a step down in terms of what the proficiency level is. It might be novice high rather than the intermediate low. And then also it's going to be specific to the content that you are working with within that unit. And these can-do statements are going to guide your daily instruction and your assessments along the way. And these should also be concrete and specific and directly related to that content and the skills of that unit. So clearly aligned with the overall can-do statements of the year, but specific to the content of the unit. So an example of some unit-specific can-do statements for the interpretive mode. In this unit, I can understand simple descriptions of people and places in short text, because maybe this is a unit about people in places such as towns or cities or in a particular country you might be studying. So that is the content. So you can understand those simple descriptions of people and places in short texts. And then for the interpersonal mode, in this unit, I can ask and answer questions about my daily routine and activities using simple statements and phrases that I've memorized and learned. So again, you're being very specific about what the language students are going to use, the text type they're going to use to engage. And by talking about daily routines and activities, that's specific to the content of the unit. And then for the presentational mode, In this unit, I can give a brief presentation about my favorite hobby using short sentences and visuals. At a higher proficiency level, you might say that I can write a paragraph. You might say I can write multiple paragraphs. You might say I can write 1 to 2 single or multi-clause sentences. I can write strings of sentences or strings of connected sentences on a particular topic. But again, you want to get very specific about what the content is and also align it with the proficiency level. That's what makes the can-do statement very concrete. So that's looking at our overarching goals for the year in terms of writing can-do statements, and then looking at the unit-specific can-do statements. So here are some general tips for writing effective can-do statements. So you want to make them student-friendly, so make them clear, simple language that students can easily understand. So we don't want to use too much language that's theoretical or too much into the jargon of proficiency. We also want to make sure that they're positive and achievable so that they motivate our students. And you may also want to involve students in the process by having them create and reflect on can-do statements. That can increase their ownership and motivation. Like, here's the topic, here's the content. What would you like to be able to do with it? And have them write one of the can-do statements that's specific to what they would like to do with the language on that topic. And then in terms of clarity and effectiveness, use action verbs that clearly describe what students will be able to do, and refer back to the Bloom's document that I referenced earlier. The statement should be measurable and allowing for clear assessment of the progress. So that it is a clear way of saying, yes, here is the evidence that I know that this has been learned, acquired, whatever language that you're using there. So once we have these can-do statements, what do we do with them? You can provide them to students at the beginning of a unit. You can post them in your classroom. You can share them digitally. There are a number of ways of having students engage with the can-do statements. Whatever works best for you, it's wonderful. Keep doing it, or try some new ways. The most important thing is that they are a continuous part of your year or your unit so that they can truly guide what you and students are doing. So what I recommend doing is posting the can-do statements in the classroom so that they're a constant reference for students. And then I use them to frame lessons and activities because they help students understand the purpose behind each task. As we move through a unit, I will every couple of days refer back to those can-do statements that are on the wall, and let's look at each one in the communication modes and say, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. And then we sort of reference, where are we right now? Are we able to do that? Maybe some students feel they are, and then I'll ask them, what more do you think you need to be able to do in order to eventually be able to do that thing that's referenced in the can-do statement? And they'll say, well, I don't know enough words on a particular topic to be able to talk about that yet. Well, that's great, and we're going to continue on, and we're going to keep doing that. But it engages them in the process and being a part of it. And so that essentially helps them to use the can-do statements for self-assessment and reflection, and it encourages them to track their own progress. So to bring this all together, can-do statements are really useful when they are aligned with our proficiency levels and they include the 3 communication modes. It also helps to make sure that we are staying on track and we are also including all of the communication modes in our classroom. And we looked at the difference between a yearly can-do statement or a set of yearly can-do statements and unit-specific can-do statements, which are going to be more granular based on that content of the unit. And then looking at that potential for increased student engagement and clarity in their language learning goals when they are aware of what's coming, of what they are doing, what they are going to be able to do with this content and the language that they're learning. And remember also that idea of the success criteria that we started with. Before you even start writing all of your can-do statements, to just look at your content, know why it is being taught. Ask yourself that question, like, why am I teaching this? Why are students learning this? So why is it being taught? How will you know that it has been learned? And then once students have learned it, what are they going to do with this content now that they've learned it? The answers to those questions may very well create your can-do statements for you. And then also consider using the Bloom's taxonomy levels because they align somewhat with the idea of the proficiency levels going from the novice all the way to the advanced. And remember that you can download the document in the show notes that has the list of verbs that I put together that you can use with each level of Bloom's taxonomy. So have fun creating your can-do statements in your classroom. Keep them concrete, keep them student-friendly, keep them proficiency aligned, and make sure that you're getting into all of the communication modes. Make sure students are aware of them and that they are a regular part of their learning. It helps to engage them in the process. So be sure to check out the show notes so you can get that link to the Bloom's taxonomy document. There's also a link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. And there are also links to get in touch with me if you would like to work together. And remember, we can either do that in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.